Now that we've discussed both carbon and water cycle, we're ready to look at the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle definitely has some similarities, but also some differences, and it is a little bit trickier than some of the other spheres. But for starters, we do notice in the image here that we can see all four spheres are interacting for the nitrogen cycle, just like we see for the water cycle. So taking a look at the picture, let's just point out a couple things. We've got, of course, the biosphere here with the trees and also with the animal. We've got the atmosphere, of course, with the sky, geosphere with the ground, and then the hydrosphere is represented by these clouds and the rain. So again, all four spheres are interacting for the nitrogen cycle. And just like carbon, we in the biosphere need the nitrogen for a couple important things. DNA, proteins, amino acids. So without nitrogen, our lives are pretty much non-existent. So this video is going to go through the notes part of the nitrogen cycle. What we're not going to do right now is the nitrogen picture. We're just going to go through kind of the process, and we'll talk about examples, and I'll point some things out in the picture, but I'm not going to have you complete the image on the back. So again, just focusing on the notes. As we go through the notes, we're of course going to be filling in the blanks, but what I'm going to encourage you to do is take some little notes on the side or in the margins as we kind of discuss things, so you have a little extra detail when we come back together to talk about it and complete the picture together. Again, as we start our discussion on the nitrogen cycle, we know it's available in all four spheres, but particularly we're going to focus on what do we need it for. So plants, animals, humans, nitrogen is essential to us, and we of course need it for DNA, very similar to carbon. So without nitrogen, we aren't who we are. So DNA would be a really nice thing to write in the margin of your notes there. That's what humans and animals need that for. Now, most of the Earth's nitrogen is not found in humans, but it is found in the atmosphere. So most of the Earth's nitrogen is found in the atmosphere. In fact, 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. So while we use the oxygen coming from the atmosphere, nitrogen is the #1 element present. So when you take in a deep breath and you inhale, you are taking in some of the atmospheric nitrogen. However, your body can't use it. Our skin and our lungs can't absorb nitrogen gas like we can with oxygen. So because we can't absorb nitrogen by breathing, what we have to do is consume. We have to eat plants and other animals, just like within the carbon cycle. So that food chain idea comes back in. Eat plants or other animals that have nitrogen. By consuming it, we get what we need. Now, living things like plants, on the other hand, they're able to absorb nitrogen differently. However, nitrogen gas is, again, something they can't use. So notice in our picture here, we don't have any arrows going into the plant from the atmosphere like we do with photosynthesis. Plants need to absorb their nitrogen through roots within the soil. So because not every single type of nitrogen is usable for living things, there has to be some natural factors that can either change or transfer nitrogen from one form to the other. And that's what we're going to look at today, is how does nitrogen from the atmosphere become usable for living things? The #1 way that nitrogen gets converted into usable forms is by bacteria. Bacteria are everywhere, especially in the soil. And so there are dozens of types of bacteria that convert nitrogen from one usable form to the other. And so we're going to start referring to bacteria as kind of the nitrogen cycle BFF. Okay, that would be a good little note to write in on the side there next to that little bacteria picture, right? Bacteria is the nitrogen cycle's BFF. So without bacteria, I've got no usable nitrogen for plants to absorb from the soil. So bacteria within the soil converts that nitrogen N2 can make a little note, that's the nitrogen gas. It can convert it into another type of nitrogen known as ammonia. And here's our chemical formula for ammonia: 1 nitrogen atom and 3 hydrogen atoms. Now here's the tricky part. That type of bacteria that converts is not converting it into a usable bacteria, but into an unusable. So here we note ammonia is toxic for plants and animals. So when we hear that word ammonia, here's what I want you to envision: a little sad face. We're going to talk about ammonia being bad. So if these bacteria are creating ammonia, which we do not want, that's not helping us out. So we've got to think about what else is going on. So luckily here we have a second bacteria, and that second bacteria does the same job as the first. It converts one form of nitrogen to another. This time we're taking the bad ammonia that we do not want, so ammonia bad. We're taking bad ammonia and converting it into a usable form known as nitrates. Okay, we're going to start thinking about nitrates, good. Okay, nitrates, good, ammonia, bad. Nitrates are good because they are the preferred nitrogen form that plants absorb through the roots as they're hanging out in the soil there. So again, bacteria, BFF of the nitrogen cycle, converts nitrogen into different forms, particularly nitrates that the plants can use. And those nitrates are important to the plants. They use those nitrates for their DNA and their proteins, and they hang on to it within their structures, right, until they are consumed or eaten by other living things. And when they're eaten, then they pass their stored nitrates on to that thing that ate them. They can also pass the nitrates on to the ground when they decompose. So we're seeing a little bit of a similarity here with our carbon cycle. Nitrogen is passed on through consumption to living things. It is also passed into the geosphere or the ground through decomposition and breakdown of that living thing. So far we've seen that nitrogen is found mostly in the atmosphere as a nitrogen gas, but it can also be converted into other forms like nitrates and ammonias within the soil from bacteria, converting it from one form to another. Nitrates are the form that plants like to absorb into them, and then the nitrates can be passed on through the food chain. But what we want to think about too is how does it get to the hydrosphere? So the main way that it gets to the hydrosphere is through rain washing it into those places. And so we want to think about what kind of materials are getting washed into the hydrosphere. So the biggest one is thinking about when animals release waste. Right? So when waste is released from animals or when they die and decompose, even plants, that waste is kind of infiltrating down into the ground. And over time, those nitrates stored within that living thing is now transferred into the soil, or like we were saying, into water, or the hydrosphere. So we've seen the nitrogen happen in all four spheres, but let's just be clear on how it gets back full circle. It's that BFF bacteria one more time coming into play. There's another type of bacteria where they break the nitrates down back into the nitrogen gas. And once that nitrogen gas is restored, it will then make its way back to the atmosphere. So again, bacteria is that BFF of the nitrogen cycle. It converts nitrogen gas, N2, into ammonia, as well as nitrates, and back to nitrogen gas. So bacteria is the BFF converting nitrogen all throughout every single sphere. So then rather than give you a summary section here at the end, I just want you to pause the video here, take a look at this list of questions and see if you can locate those notes in that half page that we just talked about. These are kind of some focus questions for the nitrogen cycle, so expect to see these as we kind of move forward. So no need to write them down. You could go back and highlight this information, but we just want to process through these questions now that our discussion is done.